All right, folks, it is April 2024. We have survived another CS2, a wildly successful and fun CS2 Boston. During CS2 Boston, we survived an April snowstorm. We survived an earthquake. And guessing by the fact that you're listening to this video, we have all survived the latest solar eclipse. And fitting with that, the only thing more fun than causing permanent eye damage by staring directly at the sun is staring directly at yet another strategy document regarding cybersecurity in the DIB released by the DoD. At long last, you may remember, back in January, we talked about the National Defense Industrial Strategy that ended with a reference to yet another strategy document, the DIB Cyber Strategy. And at the end of March, the DoD released that document, and we're going to talk about it today.
So for a couple of weeks after being absent from the show, I decided to do like many billionaires and retreat to my private bunker that is funded by I don't know what. And while I was sitting there, Jacob, I was like, turn around. Because every now and then I get a little bit lonely, right? And I realized that nothing you could do could total eclipse of the heart, Jacob. Nothing.
Okay, that's very good. Okay,
Very good.
Can't see you, but I can still hear you, and so can everyone else. Good reference. Let's get right into this because honestly, I just want to get it over with. Much like my last round of golf, the DIB Cyber Strategy left me not feeling mad, but just disappointed. And so we're going to cut through a lot of the strat speak in the 39 pages of the document to get straight to the pieces that people need to know. And if you want to know why we're so disappointed in the document, you can listen to the rest of the episode. So right off the top, let's just sort of dig through the boilerplate strategy speak that they list in the introduction to the strategy. And as you can tell by the glasses, I'm reciting this all from memory. So the DIB Cyber Strat, according to the document, is an actionable framework for sustaining a more resilient joint force and defense ecosystem. It serves as the department's strategic plan to enhance the cybersecurity and resiliency of the DIB through an overarching vision and mission covering fiscal years 2024 through 2027. The strategy outlines a set of 4 goals and their respective objectives that are aligned with interagency efforts and were developed by DoD stakeholders in coordination with the DIB, but we'll just have to see about that, to achieve a secure and resilient information environment which promotes industry competitiveness, innovation, and sustainable growth. Boy, that sure does sound nice. There's a mission statement, there's a vision statement, but as we all know, mission and vision statements have nothing to do with strategy, so we're not even going to bother to read them. There are 4 goals in the structure of the overall document. Goal 1, strengthen the DoD governance structure for DIB cybersecurity. Goal 2, enhance the cybersecurity posture of the DIB. Goal 3, preserve the resiliency of critical DIB capabilities in a cyber contested environment. And goal 4, improve cybersecurity collaboration within the DIB. Those all sound very nice. Those all sound very nebulous. I don't know what those mean, and you probably don't either whenever you're reading this document, but here's the big takeaway. Here's the big takeaway so that you don't have to read the whole doc. You don't even have to listen to the rest of the episode if you don't want to. This is the big takeaway. CMMC is a fundamental part of the DoD's strategy moving forward. End of story. No questions whatsoever. It is a prominent feature in this strategy, much as we talked about in the previous strategies that have funneled down to this newly released DIB cyber strategy. It is 100% happening, and unfortunately, there clearly is not much help coming for the DIB in ways to deal with it, right? So if you just quickly want to flip to Appendix 3 of the document, the Cybersecurity as a Service tools and support, it's sort of a cheat sheet of all the tools and support that the DoD is going to put out or has already put out for companies to deal with and have better cybersecurity. And as you can tell through our frustration and through many episodes in the past, it is almost completely disconnected with your requirements that are verified by CMMC. The tools and services being put out by the DoD themselves range anywhere from okay to pretty good. and they are almost completely disconnected from what you're actually going to have to implement in your contractual requirements. And the ships in the night effect of these two things just passing each other by couldn't be more evident when you're reading through the document. Personally, I don't see a way that the DoD makes any serious changes in their behaviors, in their offerings, in their resources and support extended to the DIB before the CMMC rules are final, especially the 32 CFR rule, which we're confident could be final as soon as the end of this year, 2024. And ultimately, 39 pages of, I mean, we shouldn't be surprised, right? 39 pages of bureaucratic gobbledygook is not a strategy, no matter what you want to say. Having an implementation plan that is also not published, separate from your strategy, is not a strategy. But closer to home for the DIB, just hoping that the DoD is going to somehow experience a fundamental change in what they're doing is also not a strategy. So you should be preparing accordingly, is my big takeaway.
So I have a larger takeaway, or a big takeaway as well. And my takeaway kind of plays on the fact that this is just a long line of people making sure that they're doing the things that they're responsible for, and the overarching strategy, right? So the overarching national defense strategy pointed out certain things. And when we reviewed that on our show, we pointed out things that we feel like could point towards, I don't know, CMMC or cybersecurity or critical infrastructure or the defense industrial base, all of these things that are really pertinent and important to us. And then another one came out, and we saw what the Defense Department took, and they siloed the things that were specific to them and turned that into a strategy that says, hey, we see your strategy. We see that we have responsibilities of that strategy.
We see your strategy. We raise you.
These are the things that this is what we intend to do to carry out what we feel is our responsibility, or the things that are pertinent to us and your overall strategy. But then it nested again, and we got into another strategy. And then we get into another strategy.
Yeah, we've raised the pot about 7 times before the flop here.
This is what I'm going to do to help you do your thing that you want everybody to do. And this is basically our department's stance on exactly how we're going to carry out this mission of protecting national defense, and based on the strategy that's there. That's my biggest takeaway. When I look at the goals, I immediately look at all 4 of the goals that are pointed out in this strategy, and I can point back to national defense strategy elements where we reviewed them, right? And it's basically, they've gone through and they've read, and they said, hey, this sounds like something we should probably be doing, right? We're probably going to have to put it on the document, because somebody's going to ask us, hey, how's your progress with, implementing the national defense strategy? And this is exactly what it is. Now, do they act on it? That's the thing we don't know.
Yeah. And I think that, to your point, you can see the inertia in this document as the snowball has rolled down the hill from national guidance down to ultimately this document, whether you want to debate whether it's a strategy or not at this point. You can see the echoes of high-level national guidance going all the way down to this document, which is something that people should be aware of, because I really struggled when this came out, reading it, sort of figuring out how we were going to talk about it, just sort of how to approach it, because I sort of have 2 minds about it. One is, it's not a surprise that a strategy document is disappointing in terms of how it's going to work on the ground for real people dealing with real cyber requirements. That's not anything new. And so there's a lot of critiques that you can make about, should they have done this? Should they have done that? Should they have done this? But more to the point of what we really do on this show is, it is an indicator that CMMC is a thing that's happening, and that rhetoric around helping the DIB is not as close to what the DIB actually needs as people think it is. And so if you're waiting around for the primes to help, for the government to help, for specific DoD offices to help, for CMMC to fundamentally change in some way, all you have to do is look at the strategy documents, the many of them, the rulemaking process, the NIST revision process, and the thing that comes away more so than just the fact that they're generally out of touch with what's really happening on the ground is that they're still going to happen regardless of how out of touch they are. So, this is something I was talking about on LinkedIn. Strategy, the idea of a strategy is it's about using leverage over a specific problem, right? Strategy was one of my favorite topics in my MBA courses. I find it to be a very, very interesting field of study. one of my favorite phrases that they say about strategy is playing the game that you can win. So, we've got a kid in middle school who just started wrestling, and we talk about this all the time in terms of the strategy. Is like, if the other person's bigger and stronger than you are you going to try to play the game where you're bigger and stronger? If they're smaller and faster than you are you going to try to play the game where you're smaller and faster? You have to play the game that you can win. That's your strategy, right?
Absolutely.
Anyways, when you read this document, they never describe it that way. They never say this is the specific problem. They just talk about goals and visions, right? So you sort of have to reverse engineer what the problem is that they're trying to address by reading through the document. And the thing that stands out to me is that it is very clear that DoD's primary problem that they are addressing with this document is internal coordination and communication about all the offices in charge of various things related to DIB cybersecurity. That could be everything from policy to process to individual tools and services to DoD instructions and guidance. The whole kit and caboodle here. And the DoD's main problem, that internal coordination communication, is not the DIB's problem, right? The DIB's problem is implementing the requirements, passing their assessments, and then funding the whole thing, right? That's the problem. Secondary to that is probably CUR marking and undermarking, which is also a DoD problem, which we'll talk about in a second. But when you read the strategy, DIB implementation, DIB funding, DIB dealing with the specific requirements, DIB going through the assessments, not mentioned whatsoever in terms of actually bringing their resources to bear to deal with that problem. So this strategy document, in my opinion, is not written for the DIB. It's written for the DoD about the DIB over there, right? So if you go into it with that lens, it'll start to make more sense. It might be slightly less frustrating. It wasn't for me, but your mileage may vary here. So overall, DoD seems to believe that the DIB's problem is primarily a lack of threat intelligence and information sharing about cybersecurity incidents. And if they could just get everybody coordinated and communicating and on the same page, and they could get that information to the DIB, well then, kaflooey, cybersecurity will be better. And I don't think that's the DIB's problem. I'm pretty sure that people listening to this podcast don't think that's the DIB's problem. I don't think anybody who's been outside of the meetings in the Beltway who drafted this policy by committee would think that that's the DIB's specific problem. But let us know in the comments if you think that is the main problem that DoD should have spent a couple years drafting a strategy to address. Okay, so
isn't that dependent on whose perspective?
You think it is though, a right? problem. I will say it is a problem, right? So better information sharing and threat intel sharing is sort of the ultimate goal of the public-private.
Because I feel like the biggest problem is the embarrassment that data is being stolen, our goods are being replicated that we spend a lot of money to develop, like the F-35, and the DoD doesn't know exactly where it's going, right? That is a very huge problem. It is the DoD's problem. The reason why this collaboration and information sharing it gets put to the preface, I destroyed that word.
I know.
Gets pushed to the forefront of the conversation is because nobody's reporting it. People are scared to report. And if they don't report, we don't know the tactics that are being used. And if we don't know the tactics, it's perfect example. You play basketball against somebody and they are known, March Madness just ended, they are known to drive to the hole with their left constantly. But if you make them shift to the right, they start missing shots, right? The DoD is trying to learn how to get their adversaries to start driving to the right and missing shots. But they don't know unless they have the videotape. The only way they're going to get the videotape is through this collaboration. So this is a very key element. Should it be the number one element? No, because if they're just frolicking around in systems, not being detected, and there's no sense of knowing what's going on in any of these systems that hold this data, then obviously there's a problem. Well, there's multiple problems in the DoD, right? Yeah. And right now we're arguing about which cancer-ridden patient needs treatment the most, right? You have to pick one.
To your point about
that was a little extreme, but you know what I mean.
But but it's a fair metaphor. To your point about perspective, right? From the DoD's perspective, the problem isn't a threat intel information sharing problem, right? But from the DIB's perspective, that is not the problem, because if you throw a bunch of threat intel information at them, right, their first problem is not a lack of threat intel. Their first problem is probably the number one control on the DIBCAC top 10 other than satisfied list. And their number two problem is probably the number 2 item on the DIBCAC top 10 other than satisfied list, all the way down to number 10. And then it's funding, and then it's the requirements. It's implementing the requirements. We've had GAO reports. We've had years of studies. We've had DIBCAC assessments show this, right? Threat intel sharing is a problem. It is not the problem. And it is probably not even all that early on the critical path of problems to get to a robust threat intel information sharing cycle. But that's what the strategy says. So let's just talk about, let's give them a break, right? Let's talk about the things that are good about the strategy. And I think that just to sum up the perspective part here, DoD summarizes their problem that the document kind of orbits around at the very end. It's buried in one of the objectives on like page 25 or something. They say the various offices in the department produce, maintain, and facilitate programs and services to help DIB contractors bolster cybersecurity. That's true. Then they go on to say, while these services provide immense value to the DIB, access to those resources is managed by the offices providing them and limited by different authorities. That is their problem, right? You have a bunch of different offices, you've got a bunch of different teams, you got a bunch of different departments, you've got a bunch of different programs, and nobody is in charge of all of it. They don't coordinate, they don't communicate, they're not all moving on the same page. And so from the DoD's perspective, that is their main problem because they can't get everything moving in the same direction. Now, if you could wave a magic wand and then suddenly get everybody on the same page and collaborating, would that suddenly fix cybersecurity in the DIB? I don't think so. So I don't think that's the main problem that needs to be addressed, but that's the strategy that we have. So what's good? What's good about the strategy? So if you read the strategy, it does a very good job of outlining all of these stakeholders, internal and external to the DoD. It does a very good job of explaining the various offices in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense. It talks about DC3, it talks about NSA, it talks about state, local, tribal governments and how they play into the ecosystem. So they do a very good job of outlining this landscape of this stakeholder ecosystem that they have trouble coordinating and communicating amongst. They also do a good job of explaining their responsibilities stemming from FISMA, stemming from Presidential Policy Directive 21, otherwise known as PPD 21. This is the document that puts the DoD in charge of the DIB as a critical infrastructure sector. In the language of PPD 21, the DoD is the Sector Risk Management Agency, the SRMA, for the DIB critical infrastructure sector, much like the EPA is going to be the Sector Risk Management Agency for its critical infrastructure sector. So PPD 21 is what outlines that. They also talk about their responsibilities stemming from Executive Order 13556, which governs and starts the federal CUI program. Another thing that they do that's very good, they explain the alignment to national and department guidance, to your point. So they go all the way from the National Defense Strategy, the National Cybersecurity Strategy, the DoD Small Business Strategy, the DoD Cyber Strategy, the National Defense Industrial Strategy, the DIB Sector-Specific Plan, the CISA Cybersecurity Strategic Plan. Surprise, surprise, the policy people are very good about connecting the dots about all this big funnel of policy that gets us down to this DIB cyber strategy. So if you're curious...
Yeah, I think when they start not aligning, that's when you start having issues, right? When we get all the way down to... Yeah.
Yeah, they're definitely in alignment. Yeah, for sure. Now, how precise they are at lining up with this ecosystem of strategy versus how accurate they are to leveraging their resources over the actual problems is a different story, right? So let's talk about what's not in the strategy, right? Just to save everybody some time. Fixing CUI marking and undermarking is not mentioned whatsoever. And this was pretty surprising to me because we've had a DoD IG report that's been out now for almost a year that was just terrible in terms of its findings, right? The DoD components are marking CUI in single-digit rates. All of the people that they interviewed across the DoD components say that they would otherwise love to start marking the data accurately, but the tools are not available to them for various reasons. It's just a disaster in terms of the DoD's ability to consistently mark CUI, whether it's an overmarking problem or an undermarking problem. That's primarily the issue that's driving requirements to implement controls in the DIB, which ends up in this cascade of funding and issues and maintenance and assessment and controls and all these things through these various DFARS clauses. They don't mention it whatsoever. We've never heard a follow-up at all. You go to CS2, You go to a webinar, you go to any event, you stop random people on the street and you ask them, what are you mad about as a defense contractor? And they'll say, the CUI marking problem. Basically, end of story. So they don't talk about that whatsoever. They also don't talk about funding of any kind. And in fairness to DoD, they don't hold the purse strings, right? If there's no appropriation for specific things, then they don't have the money. And so they're not themselves the appropriators of money. But nowhere in the strategy do they talk about a lack of funding and why that needs to be fixed, nor do they talk about any funding that would be otherwise available in any way whatsoever. Now, that is generally outside of their control, but just so you're aware, they don't talk about funding at all, which is a huge problem for DIB companies. My personal pet peeve over the years, and probably one of the easiest things that they could do to clarify what their tools and services actually mean for people on the ground in a language that matters to them, they do not map the various tools and services offered by DoD and NSA to the requirements that are being extended to them by the DoD, right? This has puzzled me for years. I've had individual conversations with people at NSA and DoD. They refuse to do this project. They've taken it up internally multiple times, only for these projects to be killed. If you do not map your tools and services, I know you can't tell, I'm looking right at you, DoD and NSA. If you do not map your tools and services to 800-171A in the same way that private tools and services are required to map their tools and services to 800-171A, then you are no better than the companies who are basically selling people claims about how much value they have at meeting their requirements. Now,
if we're being honest, it doesn't take that long.
It doesn't take that long. We know what the requirements are. You helped write them. These are the same sorts of requirements that the DoD and the NSA has been using for 20 years in 853. So what they'll say a lot of the times is these are services designed to help bolster cybersecurity. And I don't care how much security value they will provide. If you do not map those security services to what companies are required to do, then they are of little value to them, right? You are going to only be able to make marginal differences on the edges of the ecosystem for people who are bought into the idea of better security. If you want to move the needle, map them to the requirements and speak to them in the language of what you're requiring the DIB to do. It's not hard.
Big fella, I'm going to jump on my soapbox again.
Go for it.
We're not mapping them to 800-171 because they're not intended to help with 800-171 requirements.
It's a good point.
They are intended to help with the number one priority that you pointed out as is evident by this strategy: collaboration, sharing, incident reporting, and identification of threats, right?
Yep.
What do all of these tools do? Dice cubed, what does it do? It stops people from going to malicious websites. It ingests threat intelligence and points out malicious websites and things like that, malicious activities, and it stops that action from happening on DIB networks. Right, stops them from traveling to nefarious places. Okay, cyber readiness and things like that. These are good things to help people understand what's doing if they have the staff that's going to be able to ingest the 80,000 people this program was just opened up to.
I think one of the good examples that you bring up all the time is the NSA PDNS service. The PDNS protective DNS service is a great service. It is actually going to provide tremendous security value. And guess what? It's not required, right?
It's not required.
And so it was almost required with the Delta 20 under CMMC 1.0, which would have been very nice, but it's not required. And so you can make the case all you want to, but ultimately, if it's voluntary and it's not required, more companies than not aren't going to be interested. That's just the way the cookie crumbles. So,
every chance I get, I say this. If you were, and I fully encourage people to leverage every free service 100%. That is government funded. Fully agree. 100%, as long as you level expectations going into the relationship. And the expectations is that your 800-171 and CMMC progress will not move very far, but your progress in C through G of 7012 is going to move tremendously.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so your overall security benefit would increase dramatically, but that's not your main problem, right? Your main problem is making sure you have the requirements implemented. We talked at CS2 about the security value of those requirements, which we'll talk about in the future. Just you'll hit the I believe button for now, everybody. But ultimately, it boils down to this. If you were to use every single DoD and NSA service that they have available today, and even the ones that they reference in the strategy that don't even exist yet, you wouldn't pass your CMMC assessment. And that's really it. That's really the end of the story. Now, you could be mad about it. You could think that it's not the right thing that they're going to do. These are the strategies and tools that they have been putting out for a couple of years now. Now it is, written down in black and white in this document at the end of the day. And so, like I said before, the real thing to take away from this is there isn't going to be some manna from heaven that falls at the last moment. There aren't going to be magical cloud enclaves that are fully subsidized and ready to go, fully compliant, just for all the DIB contractors and subcontractors out there in the ecosystem. It's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. So, at this point, if you are going to read the rest of the strategy, one more thing that is not in the strategy itself: small business challenges, right? So there's no funding, there's no fixing CUI, there's no mapping the tools and services to the requirements. There's no mention of the main challenge out there, which is small business challenges, funding, resources, all the people who are below what we call the cybersecurity poverty line, in which you don't have the internal expertise and resources to deal with these external requirements and things like that. So small business challenges are mentioned sort of offhand in a reference in one part of a objective under goal 2, where they're talking about a pilot program that I can't tell if it's actually happening or not. It may or may not be happening, where they're going to try to understand small business challenges a little bit more. Not exactly a shot of confidence in the small businesses that might be reading this strategy, but that's the way the strategy is written. So,
there's always next year.
Take from that what you will. Like I said before, the odds of that suddenly turning around between now and December, when the final rule might be out and the market is just sort of let off of its leash, pretty much zero. Okay, so we talked about what's good. We talked about the overview. We talked about what's not in the strategy and the sort of main takeaway. If you are still interested, let's talk about the rest of the strategy as quickly as possible. So there are 12 objectives across these 4 goals of the strategy. And if you read through the strategy, you will get the distinct feeling that you're going around in circles, and you're right, because it is extremely repetitive. It cross-references the same thing multiple times across multiple objectives, and it really doesn't need to be as long as it is. So, one way to cut a lot of size out of the document is to understand that goal 1 and goal 3 fundamentally are the same thing. So when you compare the objectives listed underneath goal 1 and goal 3, it boils down to DoD as an internal coordination and communication problem. So goal 1 says strengthen the DoD governance structure for DIB cybersecurity. Goal 3 says preserve the resiliency of critical DIB capabilities in a cyber contested environment. Those sound like different things when they describe the goals, but when you dig into the objectives, they're talking about the same problem. So they say under objective 1.1, strengthen interagency collaboration for cross-cutting cyber issues. For fiscal years 24 through 27, the department seeks to mature the cross-departmental mechanisms for a coordinated response to managing cyber risk. Government stakeholders must collaborate to bolster DIB cybersecurity, and they reference something known as the Department of Homeland Security Critical Infrastructure Partnership Council, the DHS CPAC, which we'll link to in the description below. You may be interested to know the DHS CPAC has been around for like 20 years. So they also reference the NSA Enduring Security Framework, which is a program I had never heard of, which has also been around for a really long time. So we're going to take these things that have been around for a really long time and have clearly not worked, and we're going to do them harder. And it's going to be, this time it'll be different.
We're going to do it with a strategy, okay? We're going to plan to use them right this time.
Now, maybe the strategy is enough to motivate the people who are participating in the Enduring Security Framework and the DHS CPAC, but I got a feeling that they're just pointing to things that they've already been doing and calling it a strategy. So objective 1.2, advance the development.
It's a good feeling.
It feels great. Advance the development of regulations governing cybersecurity responsibilities of DIB contractors and subcontractors. They say, for fiscal years 24 through 27, the department will work with the DIB and interagency DoD stakeholders to build a governance framework for maintaining a secure subcontractor cybersecurity environment. Now, you can read this quickly and think, oh, they're going to build an environment for DIB contractors to operate inside of. And as I've read this multiple times, I don't think that's what they're talking about. I think they're talking about the environment of coordinated entities inside and outside of DoD. That's the environment they're talking about. It's the policy coordination environment. They go on to say, Regulations governing the flowdown of cybersecurity requirements for DIB subcontractors is an evolving and shared responsibility, which leverages numerous stakeholders in pursuit of the guidance and processes to establish, mature, and maintain cybersecurity best practices applicable at the lower tiers. Ultimately, this is strat speak, this entire section under goal 1 for coordination is bad. We need coordination to be good. That's all that section has said. We have a coordination communication problem. The reason why I say that goal 1 with pages of this strat speak is the same as goal 3 is that when you dig into the objectives under goal 3, they say prioritize the cyber resiliency of critical DIB production capabilities. The Government Coordinating Council and the Sector Coordinating Council will work together. All right, so the Government Coordinating Council is the group of government agencies that are loosely tied together with the Sector Risk Management Agency responsibilities. We'll link to the charter if you're interested in more. It's a long-standing construct that has existed for a while now. The Sector Coordinating Council for the DIB is the group of mega prime contractors that have formed the DIB Sector Coordinating Council for years and years and years. And so under this objective, those two groups, which have existed as the status quo forever, essentially, are now suddenly going to work together under the CPAC, which we mentioned earlier, to share information about threats, assess and mitigate vulnerabilities, and monitor the security and resiliency of the DIB. I'm not sure what they've been doing for the last 20 years, but the strategy says that they're suddenly going to be doing something different and it's going to help. But again, it's about sharing threat intel information, not about implementing the requirements, funding, or CUI problems. And just lastly, to wrap up section or goal 3 here, the last objective under there is establish in policy the priority to focus on cybersecurity for critical suppliers and facilities. Again, they reference coordination and integration of policies and plans are needed for clear and consistent roles and responsibilities related to DIB cybersecurity. As the Sector Risk Management Agency for the DIB, the Secretary of Defense designates a principal cyber advisor as the coordinating authority in charge of all of this coordination that we need to help fix the coordination problem for more coordination. Now, if you look into this principal cyber advisor, that is a position that was just filled on March 29th of 2024 temporarily, because this is supposed to be an appointed position. So there has been no one doing the coordination, which is probably why they're panicking about that being the problem. And until the election is over and maybe we get an appointee in the next administration, no one's going to be coordinating it. So congratulations, we're now multiple pages into the strategy, and the person who's supposed to be in charge of solving your main problem probably doesn't have the authority to do so, and they won't anytime soon. And they certainly won't before CMMC becomes a real thing for people to deal with in the real world.
So for 20 years, they tried to figure out who was in charge, realized nobody was in charge, and now somebody's in charge. That's why this is going to be different. There's going to be a person in charge overseeing it, right?
Maybe
there's a strategy. There's a person. We had this strategy. Who didn't execute the strategy? For the longest time, everybody was just pointing fingers like, who's in charge of this?
Yeah.
And now we realize that
the fact that they just filled this position at the end of March and the election is in November and it's supposed to be an appointed position is a joke, right? No issue with the person who's appointed to there or to the poor brigadier general who's the deputy to that position, who probably also doesn't have the authority to coordinate any of these things. It's just a mess. They have a massive internal coordination problem, and that's clearly distracting them from the ability to see what the problems on the ground are. So, you can let that frustrate you, but ultimately that's the way that they're operating. So CMMC is not going to get diverted while they're dealing with this problem. All right, so that's 2 of the 4 goals and 4 of the 12 objectives. It basically constitutes half of the overall strategy. So meanwhile, goals 2 and 4 basically repeat the same thing over and over and over again. If only we had more threat intel sharing, then cybersecurity would be different, as if that is the main problem. So goal 2 says, enhance the cybersecurity posture of the DIB. Goal 4 says, improve cybersecurity collaboration with the DIB. So let me just read some excerpts here from those sections of the strategy, and let me know if you sense a pattern in what they think enhancing and improving cybersecurity in the DIB is going to be. Bolstering cybersecurity of DIB assets requires the ability to disseminate relevant and timely threat information. The department seeks engagement with the DIB Sector Coordinating Council to facilitate expanded sharing and analysis of cyber incident trends to advance DoD's understanding of the cyber posture of the DIB. Paramount to improving this strategy is improving communication with the DIB. The department is committed to providing timely, relevant, and actionable threat intel to DIB contractors. Just if we could just give them the threat intel, then security would just emerge organically in the DIB, right? Because clearly that's the only thing that has been preventing people from implementing their requirements over the years is just an understanding of threat intel information. And if we could just...
Maybe they didn't know there was a threat.
Maybe they didn't know. And if we could just coordinate everybody inside the department in such a way that we could communicate more clearly and provide them with threat intel, then everyone would improve their cybersecurity and implement their requirements, right? Right. So all 8 of the objectives across goals 2 and 4, the remainder of the strategy, refer to the same 3 resources for cybersecurity tools and services over and over and over again. This adds to that circular effect when you're reading the document because they just keep pointing to the same 3 things over and over. They point to the Defense Cyber Crime Center, DC3, and the DoD Defense Industrial-Based Collaborative Information Sharing Environment, otherwise known as DICE, which we heard from Terry Kalka at CS2. So DC3 DICE is what they point to. They also point to the now expanded DIB CS program, the DIB Cybersecurity program, been around for like 12 years, where they share all this information about what's going on, but it was only available to cleared defense contractors. They recently published a final rule that expanded eligibility to that program to non-cleared contractors and their MSPs. And so participation in that program will help this process of information sharing and threat intel sharing, along with the various tools and services that fall under the umbrellas of those 2 programs. And then in addition, they talk about the NSA Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, which hosts the tools like PD&S and attack surface management. And they say through the DoD's public-private DIB CS program, the NSA CCC, and the DC3 DICE, the department will provide cyber-as-a-service offerings to eligible DIB contractors in a scalable and cost-effective manner. See Appendix 3. DoD says that they're going to collect all of these tools, services, offerings, and various pieces of information into a single place so that they're easier for people to find. And that's it. That's the strategy. That's the idea. They're going to coordinate to make the information easier to get. They aren't going to map those tools and services to the individual requirements or assessment objectives in 171A. So you have no idea what they mean against the things that you're actually going to have to implement in order to get a contract to participate in these programs in the first place. They don't talk about CUI. They don't talk about funding. They do a great job of talking about how this fits in the hierarchy of other policy documents that don't address those issues. And that's what we were all waiting for. In case you're curious, there are some weird vestiges of references to the NIST cybersecurity framework. Apparently, we'll link to the article, last year in 2023, the plan was they were going to take all of these tools and services and they were going to map them to the functions of the cybersecurity framework: detect, respond, recover, things like that, which is probably not a bad way of categorizing the tools and services that the department has on offer if they're not going to map it to 171 and 171A. But the committee probably decided that that was not a good idea for whatever reason, and they ditched that idea. So the tools and services aren't mapped to the CSF, but they still reference the CSF as being very important to pay attention to, but they don't tell you why. So if you find that confusing, it's just a leftover artifact of what the strategy was supposed to be last year.
So when I look at this, I feel like that there are two major problems that the DIB has that are being addressed, and I brought them up again. DIB organizations aren't implementing controls, and DIB organizations aren't reporting incidents, aren't reporting when things happen to them, fear for reputational damage, whatever it may be. In this strategy, the Department of Defense outlines two ways that they are going to attack and improve those elements of the problems that they have. Attacking and improving, 22% of the organizations that were attesting to implementing NIST 800-171 actually implemented NIST SB 800-171. So how do they improve that? They put a validation mechanism in place. For all things security implementations, they're CMMC, right? Let's like MasterCard out this piece.
Yep.
And then for all things about incident reporting, apparently we're going to go on the premise that we believe that you guys just didn't know how to report the incidents, couldn't recognize an incident, didn't know what it looks like, didn't know exactly what to tell us or what may happen to you or the order of events that you need to go through. So we're going to give you a whole bunch of resources that are going to help you understand that too. It sounds like with one strategy, 2 birds were killed with one stone.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, right? The fact that companies aren't implementing their requirements is a DoD problem. Their solution to that problem is to establish a verification program with CMMC to make sure that you implemented the requirements.
It's a verification program, but it's a verification program that has an ecosystem attached. And part of the ecosystem being spun up is what? The spinning up of professionals, no matter what level that they may be, that are credentialed at some point in manner that can help you implement the controls, right?
Yeah.
I think that the DoD is assuming this is a part of our strategy. That joint's been put in place for 5.5 years. Slow rolling, but it's there. We're just going to mention it a little bit here. And then let's talk about the other overarching thing that is absolutely hammering us as a country right now is the fact that things are happening and nobody knows that they're happening. And China's just sitting around in networks for 6.5 months without anybody noticing.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, you can't tell reading the strategy document if the hard problems that the strategy doesn't address are purposeful omissions or if they just don't understand the nature of those hard problems, because there just isn't a lot of time spent in this strategy explaining the problems or why they're centering on these problems specifically.
But have you ever heard that thing, like if I told everybody my problems, if I listed my problems, I'd have a scroll, right?
Sure,
I think the 39-page strategy was the condensed version of, oh crap.
Sort of. I'm putting on my hat, and we'll link to a book that I'm a huge fan of. Richard.
Does the hat match the glasses?
What glasses? So there's a book that I like a lot by Richard Rumelt. He's a strategy professor at UCLA, and of course you're going to have a million problems that you could deal with. Part of the strategy is figuring out what are the problems you're going to deal with, because putting effort and resources to them, it will actually have leverage over the rest of the problems, right? You're playing the game that you can actually win. When I read this strategy, I think they missed the mark. I think that for companies that are dealing with CMMC and their requirements, all you need to know is that CMMC is still clearly going to be a massive part of the DoD strategy. It's still 100% happening. And your problems in meeting the things that you need to meet in order to get your CMMC certification are not the things that DoD is addressing in the strategy, because that apparently is not their main problem. So love it, hate it, think what you will. That's the way that the document is written. So I encourage everyone to read it because we've been waiting on it forever. So if you would like more details, we'll definitely link to the strategy below. And that's basically the DIB strategy in a nutshell. And we'll see you next week.
See you next week.